And now on to the show. We have culinary scientist, author, and educator, Ali Bouzari. He's going to be presenting Ingredients as a Catalyst, X-ray Vision for Cooks, along with Chef Jamie Simpson from the Culinary Vegetable Institute, and David Skinner. Thanks, chefs.
Good morning. How are you guys doing? This is going to be a caffeinated session. Can you hear me okay? Cool. Hi, I'm Ali. Do you guys like butter? That's like a weird pandering audience question for a conference like this. It's the same as like, who in here is currently wearing like bacon on their clothing? Okay, so I work a lot with chefs all over the world, and one of the things that comes up a lot is these assumptions that we have about how and why food does what it does, and digging into that so that we can love the things that we love a little bit more. So we're going to dive into hopefully a crash course in how you guys are going to gain a superpower during the session, and it's going to be rad. Who in here did not enjoy science in primary education? Liars. Okay, so there's like 10 times more than just raise their hands. You are the people that I'm most excited to talk to because I do science. I did a PhD in mashed potatoes. There's a 356-page dissertation on Robuchon potatoes that exists that I got paid by the state of California to do. Nice. Science is good. That's great. I'm way more interested in less in deep dives and more in the science of everyday stuff. So to give you guys a sense, for doing that PhD, it was 4 years long, and about 4 weeks into that program, we figured out everything about how a mashed potato works. We figured out the important role that truly butter plays in making mashed potatoes. We figured out the role that water plays. We figured out basically the guidebook to impressing my like parents-in-law forever at Thanksgiving with mashed potatoes that will blow their mind. The rest, the next 3 3/4 years, the potatoes did not get any better. That was all trying to really prove beyond a doubt that this specific molecule was responsible for this specific thing. None of that level of understanding of science, and I will defend this to my death, helps us make food any tastier on a day-to-day basis. And we got so weird and into the weeds on the science of starch and how cell walls interact with it that I stopped feeling a connection to how this was actually going to make food better. And so the way that I like to talk about food is more on a level of food. These are recognizable ingredients, right? By the way, it turns out when you write a book, speaking of bacon, publishers really want you to have bacon on the cover. And I'm just contrarian, so I sliced brisket weird and sideways, and that's our bacon. So when you look at this stuff, these are ingredients, and this is the parlance of our times, where you're going to be explaining, if you're doing a demo, you're going to be like, this is how I made this blueberry puree, this is how I bruleed this onion, this is how the corn was popped, right? Everybody agree with that? That's great, but I think that there is a level there that is too up in the atmosphere and too confusing for us to speak really clearly to each other as chefs and eaters and speaking to your employees and speaking to the press and writing recipes and just hanging out with your uncle at a barbecue. There is a level deeper that we can go that if we do it right, it actually makes stuff simpler. And that level is with these things. That if what we've got on the top are the ingredients with a lowercase I, in a fit of being drunk with power, I decided that these things were going to be the ingredients with a capital I. They're going to be the deified Greek pantheon of ingredients. These things control literally everything you will ever taste, cook, eat, or serve again. This is it. This is the playbook. This is all you got. This is the alphabet. With this alphabet, you can compose a sonnet, or you can write a commercial jingle, right? Everything is in there. This is the science of 3 Michelin star food. This is the science of Hot Pockets, right? This is the science of roast chicken. This is the science of stuff that requires a centrifuge and levitates and reads your astrological horoscope, right? So this is everything, and the idea is, what if we can present it in a way that doesn't require science knowledge to understand? So for a book that I wrote, I did it with a comic book artist, and every chapter was dedicated to these things and their personality. And every chapter was actually written in a different, or illustrated in a different medium. So the water chapter was done in a watercolor. The lipids chapter was done in oil paint. The minerals chapter was done with graphite, and the heat chapter was done digitally, because heat isn't physical, man. We're dangerously close to the beach, and my McConaughey is going to come out. So when you get into this, these are the fundamental building blocks. These are the gears that turn. And what's amazing is that they all have a very set, very predictable personality. So imagine these like your 8 closest friends. You know which of those you want to invite on a hike. You know which of those is not going to offer to pitch in for groceries if you're all going to cook dinner together. You know which of those 2 hate each other and you shouldn't invite to dinner together because it's going to be awkward. There's just like a gut instinct of how these things work, because they do the same thing in every single food there is. So when you're looking at the froth on the top of a cappuccino, or a beer, or literally anything foamy ever again, there are proteins in there doing you a solid. They're always going to do that. So again, you guys like butter. Have you guys ever clarified butter? Who in here went to fancy and expensive culinary school and was taught how to clarify butter by somebody with a mustache? Okay. Butter in the process of clarification. What is the middle layer? Come on. It's fat. This is butter, this is fat. What's the stuff on the bottom? Solids. What are those? We'll get there. What the hell is the thing on top? I never understood this. What is that? How is that different from that? Why does some go up there and some go down there? So this is the level of just like instinct, where even if you've never learned this fact before, you should know that there's proteins and gas and water up here. And when we get through this and you guys have your new superpower, you're going to be able to look at this and say, okay, cool. Lipids, which by the way, of all of those up there, lipids is just fat, grease, oil, emulsifiers. It's everything greasy, all under one umbrella. So this is where lipids live. This is where water lives. Water is heavier than fat, so it's going to be underneath. There's going to be solids there, which are like proteins and sugars and minerals. And then this stuff on the top is just some of those proteins and sugars and minerals that hitched a ride on some bubbles. That's all it is. And as you continue to cook this and it continues to bubble, what happens to that top layer? Chefs, come on. What happens to that top layer? It goes away, right? It slowly goes away as this crazy hot liquid plancha of butterfat toasts off all the water. If you don't have water, you can't have a foam. If it's this hot, all of that stuff then drops down to the bottom and joins its brethren. So I don't want you guys to have to memorize anything. This is truly a new language. This is something that as me and Jamie and David start talking about these demos and how these things work, there's stuff in here that every chef has done a gazillion times. And we're going to get to this level of understanding where even if it's your first time doing something, you're going to be able to like sight read it and figure out all the bits and pieces. Have you guys seen the Lego movie?
No.
Either the Lego movie or the Matrix, depending on how many kids you have. But that moment where either Keanu Reeves at the end of the Matrix or everybody in the Lego movie sees something and they immediately like break it down. They figure out how everything fits together. They see all the lines of code falling at the end of the Matrix. That is what it's going to feel like walking around and looking at food that's either on a plate or in a pan. Sound good? Let's do the thing. So, water is important. Agreed? Yes, water is good. Water does this for our food. This is it. This is everything that water can do in all of your food. It has like 5 tricks, right? So water can turn solid liquid to gas, which is really useful in leavening a croissant. Water, if you play keep away with water, you can keep things from rotting, and you can cure and preserve and ferment things. Again, how many people went to fancy culinary school? How long did you guys spend learning sauces, like aggregate, total? All sauces, even back when they were calling any non-Western European sauce ethnic. How long? Was that months, weeks, days, 1 day? 8 weeks. All right. So what is the difference between, let's just talk French mother sauces. What is the difference between brown sauce and a white roux-based sauce? Color. Why are we teaching that on different days? One of the ways that we should be thinking about food is water is the thinnest liquid in the kitchen that we can eat without dying. Water is very not nappe, right? It flows around really, really well. So one of the things that you should immediately start envisioning is water is just a bunch of little tiny water-shaped marbles that are rattling around in here. So that when it's in a bottle, when you swirl it on your tongue, it's very thin because those marbles can just roll around really easily. The only way to thicken any sauce on planet Earth is to either put stuff in water's way, put a bunch of hurdles and roadblocks and shit in water's way, or to remove heat. If you change the ratio of stuff that's in water's way or you remove heat, that is the key to thickening literally every sauce will ever do. So stuff you can put in water's way. If I'm water and I'm walking from A to B, this is pure water. It's very easy, right? Please nobody throw anything. If all of a sudden there's a bunch of starch and there's carbs in my way, or if there's like droplets of fat, or if there's proteins, or if there's a ton of sugar, I now can't just walk from A to B. I have to like duck and dodge, and it takes a really long way to get to the end. And that extra time that water has to spend navigating is why things become thick and sticky and creamy and frothy and starchy. Does that make sense? So this is the key to everything. This is how hollandaise works. So you've got proteins in an egg that are helping, and then as you make any emulsion, but let's treat hollandaise specifically because butter. As you whisk in more and more butter, what happens to the thickness of that thing? It gets thicker. And now you should envision just every little minuscule droplet of butter that's getting whisked into water's way. It's like jet skiing around a bunch of buoys, right? It has to navigate around all of that. What's a sauce you've made recently?
Last week, vegetable pot pie.
Yes.
The southern coast of Australia.
Oh yeah, normal. And was there a gravy in it?
Yeah.
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 What was in it?
Butter, flour,
Butterflour.
juice.
Butterflower juice. So there was probably, it was all vegetarian or it was beefy?
Beefy?
Beefy.
Not beefy.
Not beefy, just all vegetarian.
All vegetables, some milk.
Some milk. So there was proteins in the milk that were helping. There was proteins in the butter itself that was helping. There were, ooh, we're bouncing. Sorry for the seasickness. There was proteins in the flour that were helping. There was carbs in the flour. There was fat in the butter. There was probably a little bit of fat in the flour. All of that is making stuff thick. It doesn't matter whether it's a cappuccino or it's like a scallop mousse. This is the only way you can thicken a sauce. Let's talk about sugars. Who in here is a pastry chef? This is not only for you. We get to use sugars too. I was pastry chef for like 10 minutes. And pastry chefs are very like gearhead about their sugars. I do a lot of restaurant consulting, and so I bounce around to different places. And one of my favorite things is to look at either like a sorbet or an ice cream recipe that has clearly been handed down by generations of pastry chefs, who just keep adding shit to it so that by the time you're done, it's like a sorbet that has honey and invert syrup and liquid glucose and powdered glucose, and it has butter solids, and it has cane sugar, beet sugar, and maple sugar, dehydrated maple sugar that was dehydrated and then rehydrated and then thrown in the trash. It's like all of these things end up in this thing. Why? Why do we use different kinds of sugar if it's all sweet? Because like all of these ingredients, capital I, sugars do a set of stuff for us. They're not just one tool. There's not just sweetness, which is perceiving sugars with your tiny, creepy hands on your tongue. Sugars do a lot of things. Sugars can make a sauce thicker, right? As you reduce the syrup, the reason that becomes thicker is because the sugars are getting in the way. If you take that to the extreme and you reduce the syrup so far that water is removed and sugar gets packed and packed and packed, as something gets crazy thick, what happens? It'll seize and it'll become a glass. And that is creme brulee, that's Jolly Ranchers, that's outside lacquer of like Peking duck, right? That is one of the things that sugars does, just as important as anything that it can do for sweetness or for something that's sweet. Sugar is really important for browning. We're going to talk about the sugar that's in butter and the really important role that sugar in butter plays in why you should choose to brush something going into the oven with butter versus canola oil. Apart from just like flavor, apart from just the aroma and the fragrance of butter, there are reasons why you would want to do that. And we'll dig into that. Anybody ever try to make low sugar ice cream? Or like, I have a feeling you guys aren't trying to chase the dragon of like guilt-free ice cream. I don't know that that's your purview in this room. But let's say you wanted to make, I don't know, it's 1997 and you wanted to make an intermezzo for your tasting menu and you wanted to do tomato sorbet, right? Describe me the texture of that tomato sorbet if it's going to be like savory and not sweet. Icy. Did somebody say icy? Yeah, it's going to be a little bit gritty because one of the things that sugar does in all food is that it binds up water. And by binding up water, it prevents water from assembling itself into a bunch of ice crystals. And so if you're gonna pull sugar out because you don't want the thing to be sweet, something else has to go in there. The secret to less icy tomato sorbet is just a crazy amount of tomato paste. Because that tomato paste is, sure, it's going to provide sugar, but it's going to provide savoriness, acidity, a bunch of carbs from the pectin that's naturally in tomatoes, and that'll help rein things in a little bit. Lipids, so fat. Butter is not just fat. If you take away nothing from this, it's that butter is not a one-trick pony, and it's sick of you talking about it like that. Butter has a lot of fat, and fat is good. Why? Say it loud and proud. I don't think any of you would talk to your cooks like, it has flavor. It's flavorful. The most cliche thing that chefs put on shirts is fat has flavor, right? That's not all it has. Fat, like everything else, does a bunch of stuff for us. So yes, fat is a really important storage boat for flavors, specifically for aromas. So fat has nothing to do with sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami. Fat actually has almost nothing to do with taste. The flavor of fat is primarily focused on aroma. And so fat is a really important place to store the aromas of marigold and jasmine and lemon and vanilla and even the aroma of like a parsnip, which has a lot more aroma than you give it credit for. That is one thing that it does. Fat is also really important for conducting heat to your food. When fat breaks down, it does a bunch of really amazing things. When you're dry aging beef, the breakdown of fat will go from like, what is like raw, very fresh animal fat smell like for the most part? Almost nothing, if it's good, right? Like, I don't know anybody who's like, I really want my fresh chicken breast to have the aroma of hazelnuts as soon as I open the package. That's not a thing. What happens is over time, as fats get older, they start to break down. And as they break down, as you're like aging cultured butter, or as you're aging like Iberian ham, or whatever it is, you're going to get little fragments of fat that break off. And another big theme is that fragments of anything have really complex flavors. So if you're cooking sugar in a pot and it's turning into caramel, you're shattering individual little sugars into a bunch of really tasty different fragments. If you're letting fats age, they're going to sort of decompose themselves, and they're going to start to smell like flowers and fruit and tomatoes and butter and nuts. They'll start to smell musky like cantaloupes. And that is actually why cantaloupes smell kind of like a really nice locker room, because they have fats that are decomposing and they're giving off this aroma. And sooner or later, as things decompose, everything starts to smell like fish and cardboard. If it smells too much, if the fat's broken down too much. I had a chef who used to tell me, it doesn't matter if you're frying foie gras or French fries, you go home smelling the same. It's true, because as fats break down, they end up reaching this point where they set off receptors in our brain that say, hey, watch out, this stuff is old. It's one of our first ways of learning that food maybe had spoiled, was picking up on these really fragrant pieces of fat. So fat can do all this stuff. Emulsions we'll come back to, because they should not be as complicated as big culinary education wants you to think. And we'll get back to that. Heat. Chefs, do you enjoy using heat for cooking?
Love it.
Yeah.
Sweet. What does it do? Everything.
Everything.
Heat makes me sweat. Everything that we do in the kitchen with heat boils down to two things. It either makes stuff move or it makes it shimmy. I'm going to shimmy throughout this entire section. So when I can't do it. When stuff is moving, when these fundamental, the building block ingredients are moving around, that's why as you heat up a sauce, it typically becomes thinner. When you remove heat from a sauce, these ingredients are going to have less energy to move around. This covers everything from why you should always test the sauce on a plate rather than pulling it out of a pot, ripping hot on a spoon and being like, yeah, that's thick enough, because it'll set into a custard. This is why if you're trying to slice something super thin, that's the reason for that move where you put it in the freezer for a second. Right? It's a lot easier to slice like a single layer of something thin if it holds still. On the other side, on the vibration side, this is all chemical reactions. So basically, everything, all of these fundamental building blocks of food are, they're moving. Even when they're frozen, they're moving in place. They're like vibrating. And the way that stuff reacts, the way that stuff happens, is with enough heat, they'll start to shimmy and shimmy and shimmy themselves apart. So that sugar that's in a pot that you're making caramel, or even better, the sugar that's right here at the bottom of this butter, as it's getting clarified and as you're continuing to do it, let's say you're making brown butter, the sugars and the protein in the bottom of this butter are vibrating and vibrating, and as you add more and more heat, water's removed, which allows more of the heat to get to those sugars and proteins, and eventually they will start to just shatter, like a car with really bad alignment that just starts to like shudder itself apart on the highway. They will start to just break pieces off, and those pieces will smack into other pieces, and they'll smack into other pieces, and they'll create this basically like cyclone of pieces of sugar and protein and fat that start to then meld together and recombine, and you go from something that's like fresh and milky and grassy to some of the most complex flavors that we have on planet Earth that we can consume, because you've just shattered this thing and every different piece has a different flavor. Does that make sense? The other thing is, one of my favorite things to talk about is how barbecue is like a sped up library. Who in here enjoys barbecue of any type, whether or not you recognize the true greatness of Texas brisket?
There you go.
The only true barbecue. So barbecue is great. Who in here likes the smell of old books? They are the same thing. Think about this. When you are burning wood to smoke meat, that wood is made of carbs. Those carbs are going to fragment. You're going to get all these different pieces, shattered crumbles of carbs flying into the air and hopefully sticking onto your meat. How long does it take to make good smoky barbecue, typically?
Texas.
Hours, maybe a couple days, right? When you smell a first edition of, I don't know, some Dostoevsky book that's been sitting in a library for decades, when that book starts to sort of degrade, you know how books get yellow as they age? And how if you smell an old book that hasn't gotten moldy, it smells like vanilla and maybe sometimes cloves. It like smells like warm spices. There's something comforting about it. Those are the exact same aromas as what was generated when you were smoking that barbecue. So if you're burning wood at a gazillion degrees versus letting something just sit in a library at room temperature, the only difference is time. Barbecue will get smoky in a couple days. A book in a library will get smoky over a few decades. And so that's one of the things as well that we're always going to want to keep track of, is that heat is important, but heat isn't the only thing. What is the temperature, again, pastry chefs, what's the temperature that caramelization starts? Shout a number. 225? Is that what you said? Beanie? Yeah. 220, 225, 230? I was taught 231 by my mustachey pastry chef. He went to war with another pastry chef who said it was 229. It's all a lie. The temperature of caramelization is yes.
Yeah. Right.
Right? So if you, I have a feeling you guys have super slow cooked something.
Right.
There are things that will caramelize at room temp. Like, I am literally caramelizing right now. I'm not kidding. Like, human beings, there are sugars in your blood that are breaking down and caramelizing. The reason that we don't caramelize until after we die is because our bodies are recycling that stuff, and it happens really slowly. But truly, like, we are all caramel. Just, we are not going to be ready in time for service. So yeah, with that, so heat.
Like black garlic or something.
Black garlic. Black garlic caramelizes over the course of 3 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, right? That's a perfect example. Does this make sense? So I mean, this is more. There's more to this than we can get to in an hour, but this is the basic idea. So that when you look at food, you start to see these patterns that emerge. So one of the things proteins can do is they can be enzymes. Enzymes are tiny protein robots living in every cell in your body doing stuff for you. Marinate on that, because that's true and terrifying. Enzymes are responsible for tons of stuff in food, and some of the best things I've ever eaten have been owed to enzymes. So when you're aging dairy of any kind, if you're culturing butter, if you're aging like bloomy rind cheese, you've got a bunch of enzymes who are chopping up protein and chopping up sugar and turning it into acids and fragrances and umami and making textures all crazy. Another thing in culinary school that you're always taught is you can't make pineapple jello. You know that thing? It's a huge bummer. Why can you not make pineapple jello? Because pineapple has an enzyme in it that digests protein. It's also like, I grew up, my dad is from Iran, my mom's from Texas, so we grilled a lot of meat. And I grew up with like a bunch of crazy uncles who all had hot takes about like, no, tonight we're making the best shish kebab ever. And one of my uncles was like really into like early blogs, like Blogspot, WordPress, just like 55-year-old Iranian engineer who's like really into Tumblr. And he read this blog of the importance of like tropical fruits as a meat tenderizer. And so he wanted to make this like chicken shish kebab that he marinated for like a day and a half in just straight pineapple puree. So that when it went onto the grill, it was like, you guys remember Gak? The like Nickelodeon branded silly putty? It was almost exactly that texture. And what was crazy, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but if you've marinated something in enzymes, it basically becomes like sourdough bread. You know how like long fermented bread browns like crazy in the oven? It was the same thing where not only did those executioner robots chop up a bunch of proteins in the meat, those scraps of protein were now like napalm for browning, where this thing, it turned to like carbonized, it looked like charcoal briquettes within like 5 minutes on the grill because of all that was in there, which in itself is a bad thing, but that's one of the big points I want to make. None of this is good or bad. These are just tools. The fact that pineapple has a bunch of protein digesting enzymes should be a tool if you want to make miso but don't want to grow koji. Or if you want to take butter solids and you want to turn it into like your, I don't know, if you want to turn it into a soy sauce, right? If you mix butter solids and the protein that's in them with pineapple juice and let that hang out for a while, you will probably get something that when you then brush it onto something going on the grill, it's going to brown incredibly well. And that may sound crazy, but these patterns repeat over and over. Okay, so something that sugars and minerals can do is they can bind water. So that's why every Thanksgiving, every editor at Saveur and Bon Appetit and Epicurious and any website that talks about recipes scrambles and says, I need the new best turkey recipe ever, because the one for the past 20 Thanksgivings hasn't cut it yet. The reason we brine poultry is because, or meat in general, or vegetables. The reason you brine stuff is to embed allies inside of what you're going to eat. So you imagine, I talk a lot of shit about my uncle Kenneth, who's on the Texan side. If you can't tell, Kenneth is not an Iranian name. Kenneth is very anxious when it comes to turkey time, so he always opens the oven. Truly, I've actually put a padlock on the oven door in previous Thanksgivings. And so a turkey that I want to take about an hour and a half to be done usually takes about 4 hours when he's around. So that turkey is going to be dry as hell. But if you've brined it, you've embedded salt and or sugar to bear hug the water and keep it there. That is the exact same principle of why like a molasses cookie is moist. It's the exact same principle of why candied bacon is preserved. It's the exact principle of why strawberry preserves are preserved. It's the word preserved. It's right there. You're binding up water. You're binding up water in a meringue, and you're keeping proteins from high-fiving too quickly, keeping that meringue smooth. You're turning a block of ice into a popsicle or into a sorbet. Things get smoother and smoother as you add sugar to bind up water. These are all from the same thing. All right, this is a wild one. One of the things that minerals can do, specifically minerals like calcium and magnesium, is they create structures. So again, let's take a trip back to 2003. Remember when everything was a sphere? This is an inside baseball joke. How did that work? Chefs, who may or may not have done that a lot. When you're spherifying stuff.
Okay.
What were the ingredients of, like, the active ingredients that were making that happen?
Calcium
And alginate. Sodium alginate, all that, right? All it is you've got either carbs, these long snaky molecules, or proteins, these long snaky molecules, and you're binding them together to make a gel. So these little mineral chains, that's calcium or magnesium. So the answer to all of these things is minerals. So if I ask, just say minerals. So if you're making like the pimento that goes inside of a green olive, did you guys know that's the original IP of the El Bulli spherified olive?
Yeah.
The pimento, this is some food science shit, all right? This is why me and my fellow food science brethren do not get along. Just tell me if a chef would ever do this. So in order to get a little pimento pepper to go inside of a cocktail olive, those olives need to get pressure cooked to be preserved and sit in a jar on a shelf. Pressure cooking is a really aggressive process. Retort canning is a really aggressive process. So in order to make the little pimentos that go into those olives, they would take red peppers. That first of all, it was very expensive to spec a source that would give you exactly that small Brunoise red pepper. So instead of doing that, they would buy this is just big olives, the shadowy corporate entity. Olive people would buy red pepper puree, or they would buy red peppers, puree them, add sodium alginate and calcium, set those red peppers into a flat sheet, cut that into a dice that looks exactly like a diced red pepper, and then stick that inside of an olive. Yeah. So many millions of dollars went into that. So when you're doing that, that's minerals are triggering that reaction. Has anybody made tofu? Like made your own tofu? So the traditional way of making tofu is you take soy milk, which has a ton of proteins, and you use this Japanese salt called nigari, which is basically just a magnesium salt that adds shackles, and it binds those proteins together to make the tofu set. Canned tomatoes. What are the 3 ingredients in every can of tomatoes? Whole tomatoes. Tomato, usually like citric acid or something, and calcium chloride. Again, you guys probably have used a pressure cooker. What would happen if you took like a perfectly ripe San Marzano tomato, peeled it, put it into a can, and then pressure cooked it for like 2.5 hours? Would it be a perfect sphere? No. So you add calcium to link up all the pectin that's in those tomatoes and keep them intact so that when you open the can, it happens. Why is Velveeta great? Who in here hates Velveeta? Okay, so there are people in here who hate it, there are people in here who love it. Let's reach across the aisle. What is the bipartisan agreement that we could come to on Velveeta? What is one undeniable positive that Velveeta has?
Texture.
Is creamy. It's got the craziest texture ever. Sure. When you're making fondue, what is the secret to good fondue?
Texture.
Some people say it's like really expensive kirsch if you're selling kirsch. Some people say it's Ultratex if you're from Modernist Pantry. Some people say it's I don't know, years of experience. The secret to good melty fondue is wrangling calcium. Milk has a lot of calcium. Cheese has a lot of calcium. When you've got cheese proteins and you want them to melt, they've got calcium shackles on. So the evil geniuses who created Velveeta devised sodium citrate, which is another salt that vacuums all of the calcium up out of your cheese so that they can melt flawlessly. Now, you can go and you can buy sodium citrate in a white powder. I think it's way more swaggy to just have 1 brick of Velveeta in your walk-in and throw like a 1-inch cube into every pot of any like fonduta that you ever make, because then you can serve somebody something that's like $25 that was made with a little bit of Velveeta. Anyway, minerals do stuff. So cool, let's say you get through this and you're like, all right, now I need stuff to happen. I have this X-ray vision, I want to make things happen in food. You want something to brown? You need sugars and proteins, which comes from here. If you remove water, it'll brown faster. If you want something to be aromatic, you need fat, protein helps. If you want something to be crispy, you need to add sugars, proteins, or carbs, and remove water and heat. If you want something to be juicy, you obviously need water, but if you want to keep that water there, you can use minerals and sugar. Do you guys see how this is the same stuff over and over again? Because there's only 8. There's only 8 of these things, and you swap them in and out, and that is how all of cooking works, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. If you want something to be savory, you have to eat MSG. It's totally cool. It's not bad for you. Fight me. We can talk later. All right. These are ingredients, lowercase I. What do you do with a walnut? Chefs, what are you going to do with a walnut? If you got a friend with like a dope walnut tree who's like, here's a case. Cook me and my family something.
No chino.
No chino.
Yeah. Pressure cook them and eat them whole.
Pressure cook them and eat them whole, like shell and everything? Huh. I will be doing that. I traveled around to like 60 different restaurants around the country talking to chefs when this book came out. I asked a lot of people, what do you do with walnuts? And some of the most creative chefs in the country were like, I would toast it and crumble it on stuff. And I'm not saying that's a problem, but one of the issues of only looking at ingredients like this without our X-ray vision goggles is that we're a little bit like linked to all the history and past precedent of how these things work. I don't care if your tomato is going to end up being like charred skins put into tomato dashi. When you first see a tomato, you're like, Italian or California. Like there's some part of you whether you want to acknowledge it or not. There's some like weird emotional baggage associated with just the tomato. So the way we get past that emotional baggage and start to figure out how we can unlock whatever we want these ingredients to do is to stop looking at them as ingredients and start looking at them as toolboxes. Butter is not butter. Butter is a lot of lipids, a good amount of water, some proteins, some sugars, and some minerals. And as soon as you start to see it like that, you can treat it like these ingredients and you can just start to see the possibilities, right? So now when I look at butter, I'm like, cool, I've got the ability with the fat to capture aromas. I've got the ability to create emulsions. I've got the ability to keep proteins from going through. This is why butter versus olive oil for making a croissant. The fact that this stuff will solidify and you can grab it and you can use it as a physical barrier to keep proteins from doing their thing is how you separate layers of laminated dough. You can make pie crust with almost any kind of fat. You need something that does this in order to make laminated dough. With the water, you can do anything that water can do. You can make a gel out of butter water. That would probably be one of the most delicious things I can possibly imagine. With the protein and the sugar in butter, you can absorb aromas. You can, honestly, I've taken salted butter, clarified it, taken the butter solids, and used that to salt cabbage for starting a kimchi. And it is one of the craziest flavors I've ever gotten out of anything. You could take the protein and the sugars in butter, and you can use it as just a browning catalyst, right? Yeah. This is a toolbox, and this is the way I would love for everybody to start looking at food. Can we talk about some food?
Let's do it.
Sure.
So what are things that we're going to get into?
Can you hear me? Check. So we're going to look at a couple, and I was hoping, Ali, that I could ask you why.
Yeah.
Right. But we take oftentimes butter as a means of softening soups or rounding out edges. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So let's just talk about beurre blanc real quick.
Okay.
For me, I had a chef who, when he first taught me how to make like emulsified butter sauces, his guide to making beurre blanc was make a reduction that's way too heavy metal to be enjoyable. Basically, like make something that is way too salty, way too acidic, way too aggressively garlicky or herby or whatever, and then use butter to soften out its edges. And so that is exactly what's going on. One of the things that happens when you use butter as your lipid source, as your fat source in a sauce, is the fact that the fat is a happy resting place for tastes and aromas, well, just for aromas, also means that butter will kind of jealously hold on to those aromas. So it's a fine balance, right? Where if you have just enough butter in something to make it rich and delicious, you'll get this balance where the butter will capture your aromas of bay leaf and marigold and whatever, and then release them to your nose, rather than take them all the way down your throat before you get to smell them. The other thing is with the acidity, so you cannot taste fat. So the fat in butter will help to coat your tongue and like time relay the release of citrusiness, of acidity onto your tongue. So yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you're talking about. It's smoothing and rounding things by controlling the flow of tastes and aromas as they hit your tongue and your nose. It's a great question.
One of the things we do at the Culinary Vegetable Institute with vegetable juices specifically is sauces. And the butter does two things for us. It really helps the viscosity of the sauce, of the juice, and also round out the edges, as we talked about. So we're going to explore that a little bit in a little bit.
Let's talk.
Okay.
Yeah. Chef?
Yeah. And then what I'm going to do is kind of cover what do you do with both the liquid and the solids, and how do you come up with a series of textures. And I was lucky to get the fine folks over at Trex to donate some A5 Wagyu for us. So we're going to have that this morning.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I want to talk about with butter is, again, so many people are so frequently focused on the emulsion, and they treat butter as this like on-off switch. Either you're going to use whole butter that's like perfectly emulsified into a sauce, or you're going to break it apart and you use its component parts in different ways. This is not irreversible, right? This can be brought back together by a bunch of different means. And can we talk about the vegetable jus and the butter poached vegetables?
Yeah, of course. So I guess we'll look at it in 3 parts, right? The whole butter, butter poaching liquid, or butter poaching liquid. This one poached turnips. This one poached rutabaga.
Really?
Really. Same temperature, same time. So the difference, maybe starches?
Yeah. Does anybody have a hot take on why this would happen? Butter poaching liquid for poaching, these are both going to taste incredible. But in terms of the emulsion being intact, why would a rutabaga stay together? Why is it creamy and beautiful and the turnip poaching liquid separated? Yeah. Higher starch content in the rutabaga. And it might be higher starch content. It might just be that the starch was more willing to just fling itself out of the rutabaga into the poaching liquid. But basically, you're poaching vegetables in butter. If a vegetable gives up enough starch, it's going to make a roux of itself. And that will keep this whole thing together. That is awesome.
Okay. Potatoes do the same?
Potatoes do the same. I spent, again, like 2 years just looking at the interaction between butter and potatoes. Again, got paid by the state of California to do that. I took a bunch of electron micrographs of starch granules inside of a potato. And you can actually see that butter will coat those granules and change the way that starch pops out of them like a confetti cannon. Do you guys know why mashed potatoes get gummy?
Retro.
What's that?
Retrogradation?
Yeah, well, it's starch, right? Starch is these big, long chains of carbs that will pop out and start to interlink and make webs. They'll make gels. And so if you are agitating mashed potatoes too much or any sort of pureed roux vegetable, they can start to get gummy if those gels kind of seize up. And when you're poaching something in butter, you're basically accompanying each little individual piece of starch with a fatty chaperone. It's almost like shortening for a dough, but you're doing it inside of your potato puree or your root vegetable puree.
We want to pull this back together?
Let's do it.
Well, is this on or off?
I think that's off. Let's turn it back on.
Okay. We'll have to figure out how to do it first.
Fair. And so this is just the poaching liquid.
That's it. Currently. Did you say chefs have this like on-off switch for butter? On being broken or on being emulsified?
On being emulsified.
Okay, cool.
Off being like, all right, butter's broken. Let's put it into like some other application that doesn't require it to be nice and smooth.
Sure. I did bring a liquid with lecithin in case this experiment didn't work.
Yeah. Perfect.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So lecithin. Why? Do you guys use it?
Yeah.
What's it do? What's it for?
Yeah.
It's a stabilizer. When you're bringing fat droplets and water together, fat really, really hates where it is. So it's going to just flee as far away from water as possible, which usually looks just like separating out. What lecithin does is it coats each of those droplets and stitches it together with the water so that each droplet is sort of spiky. And if 2 fat droplets covered in lecithin happen to bounce off of each other, they won't stick. They will actually bounce. They will pinball off each other and stay distributed much better than without lecithin. So this is still turnip?
Turnip.
So it's already starting to split a little bit on top.
Yep.
So I think you guys can all see, this is much slower than if you just made drawn butter and whisked it together, how quickly it would separate. So again, imagine water is trying to migrate away from the fat and you've got a bunch of starch in its way. It's making it move very, very slowly, but sooner or later it's going to move, right? Sure. So adding a little bit of lecithin, adding a little bit of egg, adding a little bit of roasted garlic puree, anything with natural mustard, all of these things have natural emulsifiers in them, and all you're doing is you're coating these oil droplets with like armor so that they will bounce off each other rather than banding together and separating out.
Sure.
Yeah, this is just clarified butter with jasmine tea and a little bit of soy lecithin.
That's amazing. I've had a lot of jasmine tea. That smells different than jasmine tea. One of my favorite things to do as like a demo of how flavor works and how flavor extraction works is to take your favorite ingredient, just whatever thing you use a ton in the kitchen. Say it's, I don't know, maitake mushrooms. Steep those mushrooms in pure water, in pure butterfat, and in like vodka, and look at this spectrum of where flavors like to go. And one of the things that's really interesting is if you do that, the taste stuff, so the sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, is going to come out in the water. The aromatic stuff, the like perfume of the mushroom, is going to come out in the butter, in the clarified butter, butterfat. If you have something like alcohol that straddles that middle line perfectly, that's how they can make like cupcake vodka that is scarily accurate. Have you guys had that sensation where it's crazy how much of the like experience of a cupcake they can capture in vodka? If you walk both lines, you can get both taste from the water stuff and you can get aroma from the fat stuff, and you can capture a better picture of whatever that ingredient is. That is one of the reasons why butter is a powerful tool, is you have both water and fat present. You've got protein that can kind of straddle the middle line, and you can get a, I don't know, that jasmine, that's a more complete flavor of jasmine than I've ever smelled just steeping jasmine in water.
It's a fun trick.
Maybe maybe this guy.
Mushroom knife and
we could
croissant.
talk about, yeah.
Again, do you guys make laminated doughs? When a croissant is croissanting, why couldn't you just do this with clarified butter? Clarified butter is still solidified, correct? If you wanted to make a clarified butter croissant, or has anybody done it, first of all? What would in theory happen? What would this croissant look like if it was made with clarified butter instead of whole butter? I saw you in the back. It'd be flat. Because there's water, not only is this thing acting like a bunch of barriers to inhibit all of these layers from coming together, there is water that acts like a springboard, that as soon as it evaporates, it's embedded in every layer. It's going to push these layers apart. And again, it's the same thing over and over and over and over again. What are those?
Rutabaga. Vegetables.
Sick. I have never seen rutabaga that color.
Oh. Butter poached.
Delightful. Do you guys have questions that you've always wondered about that now is the time to answer them? I know you do. Yeah. Spicy? Spicy that's a great point. Spicy is a form of oil. So capsaicin, the molecule that's usually responsible for like hot chili peppers, is just an oily compound that actually plants derive, like chili peppers. They manufacture it out of carbs. So they create this compound that is designed to basically wage chemical warfare on us specifically. And it's completely oil soluble. So that's one of those things, like how do you fight spiciness? Rather than drinking water, which will just like smear the spiciness around in your mouth, drinking milk, eating bread, anything that has basically emulsifiers in it will help relieve yourself of the spiciness. Speaking of spiciness, did you guys know that chickens can't sense spicy?
Yes.
Chickens can't sense spicy because they don't have any teeth. And the spiciness of chili peppers was evolved specifically to keep anything that has molars from eating a chili pepper, because we'll crush the seeds and we won't spread the plants for the next generation, whereas chickens just swallow them whole and make a lot more chili pepper plants. Also, cats can't taste sweet. I don't really have anywhere to go with that, but you need to know that.
Why is that, Chef?
Yeah.
like that's some like evolutionary biology stuff. I think it's because cats eat mostly meat. They actually have a better sense of umami than we do, which comes from a lot of proteins. I tweeted that like 2 months ago and it got no play, and I was super pissed because I thought that was revolutionary. Other questions? What are things that you guys have always wondered about? What are things that you're considering doing? Yeah.
Not sure if this is gonna work.
Yeah.
No. Try that one. Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. That's a great question. So the question is around like basically starchy root vegetables becoming gummy and the relation between that and like an over-kneaded dough, overworked dough. The question was like, how does the starchiness relate to gluten? I don't know whose branding idea it was to call short grain rice glutinous, but fuck that person. That was really, it's really making my life hard. So there is no gluten in glutinous rice. The reason it's called glutinous, I mean, it's probably like some old Latin derivation where it's sticky. And remember that's the slide of the ingredients where protein is this like knotty thing, like pretzel-shaped rope, and carbs are also these like chains of sugars? It's because proteins and carbs are the like ropes of the ingredient world. They're gonna make all the nets, they're gonna make all the webs. And so if you've got carbs either in the form of starch or like pectin in a gel, or if you've got xanthan gum or carrageenan or agar, all of those are carbs. And they're just these big, long, noodly molecules that will help knit things together, including attaching to themselves. And one of the reasons that gluten-free baking is even possible to be a thing is because while gluten is a very, very special protein that does some really unique stuff, we can kind of mimic some of it by lashing carbs together rather than by lashing gluten protein together. So it's a great question. They actually, it's the same sort of fundamental pattern. That's a great question. Who else? Yeah. What do I do with walnuts? My favorite thing to do with walnuts is to make roux. I think roux is dumb. I don't get it. But I really like gumbo. And I think roux-based gumbo tastes better than, you know, okra or whatever. Walnuts and nuts in general, for something like roux, where the gluten in flour in roux is great, but really all it's there for is to be like a sacrificial lamb to brown, right? We're not like trying to form bread from the gluten in the roux, right? So if we're gonna do that and we're gonna combine things with butter and you know, make them toasty and great, why not start with something that's already nutty? So, I mean, the point of roux is to be brown, toasty, and to thicken the sauce, right? So again, just looking at the ingredients, the capital I ingredients themselves, if you want something to turn brown, you need proteins, or sugars, but you got proteins here. If you want something to be thickened, you've got the carbs and the proteins that are gonna thicken your roux. And if you want something to smell nutty, literally walnut essential oil is like buried in there, already ready to be nutty. And yeah, that's my favorite move. I also really like to do nocino, because there's all this like weird pagan moon stuff associated with it, which is fun.
Virgin fairies.
Yeah. You can make nocino out of almost any nut. I live up in Bay Area where there's pecan trees and almond trees and walnut trees everywhere. You can take any of those and turn them into like a dark nutty nocino because they all have the same building blocks.
Interesting.
Yeah. There was another question. Yeah. Yeah. What's the breaking point with carbohydrates and how much fat they can hold? It depends on how well stretched out they are. So this is actually a really good question about how much power something has to thicken a sauce or thicken a liquid, right? It all depends on how well dispersed something is. So think of the difference between making a gravy where you use your hand as a whisk versus using a whisk as a whisk versus using like a high-powered blender as a whisk. The only difference between those is that you're flinging each little tiny individual particle of starch or whatever it is into its own little atmosphere so that it can be completely surrounded by water and fat. And so when you're talking about like the limit of what a starch or a given thing can do, the one thing it's going to be based on is how evenly you're distributing it, and then just what the thing is itself. Starch is really interesting because the more you cook it, the more it's going to sort of spread out and spider out and distribute itself well. And that's why, is anybody here from the In-N-Out Corporation? In-N-Out French fries are the worst.
Oh,
In-N-Out French fries are selling you good feelings instead of crispy, well-executed French fries.
Perfect.
Because why do In-N-Out French fries have fame? Because they're fresh. They're made right there. There's somebody just like slicing Yukon Gold potatoes or russet potatoes or whatever they use straight into a fryer, which is a terrible way to make good French fries. Because yes, the starch is there, but starch makes a crispier, better French fry. It spiders out and creates a better glass if it's been cooked in water first. So that water will swell up that starch and basically make it like a slurry, cover the outside of each of those fries in like its own, almost like its own dredge. And then when that's drained and dried and you put that into a fryer, you've queued yourself up for better crispiness, better browning, better everything. And the other thing is, remember, a potato is going to contain both sugar and carbs, so starch and sugar, and as the potato ages, that starch gets turned into sugar. And those sugars will make things golden brown, but if there's too much of it, it gets just turned into just black before it can get crispy. So do you guys know how McDonald's makes the same French fry in Singapore versus Chicago? It's kind of evil, but it works really, really well. What's that? They're fried twice, which is super important. Before they're fried, they cut them and they rinse them. And they rinse off as much sugar from the surface of each of those potatoes as possible to just level the playing field. So if they get one potato that came from Idaho and is 3 months old, and one potato that came from Georgia and is 6 months old, they can make them brown the same speed.
Is he trying to melt them?
By removing sugar from the surface. And then what they do is they actually brine their potatoes in a consistent amount of sugar and salt so that they're setting everything on the same playing field. It's maybe used for devious purposes, but it's an awesome idea.
Yeah.
French fries. Did that answer your question? There was a lot in there. Okay, cool. Other questions?
On butter.
Yes.
Butter and vegetables. The bridge there.
Yeah, so butter and vegetables.
Like 40 minutes.
Cool.
Have you guys seen the thing where you
I just
cook
set those
something
back
that's...
there because they were really starting to melt.
David, I think your mic's on. Have you seen the thing where when you pull something out of a fryer, it's covered in a glistering layer of grease. As that thing cools down, everything gets sucked inward? The same thing happens a lot in different kinds of food. Wherever there's space and there's a vacuum, stuff is going to get sucked up. So when you have starch that when it starts out is in these like little like tightly packed packages of starch, when you cook starch in a vegetable, it expands and it gets hydrated. Water just like gets drawn in here. If you do it with something like butter where there's water and fat, you're going to be drawing water and fat into each of those nooks and crannies. And so it's going to change the way that that product's going to behave. So on the first hand, it's going to have more aroma. All of a sudden, you're going to take this really lean thing and you're going to basically infuse it with a landing pad for aromas. And then as the thing ages, as that rice cools down or as the rutabaga cools down, it's going to be less likely to get tough and stale because as that starch cools down, it's going to kind of accordion back on itself and crystallize, which is what just day-old starch feels like. If you have a bunch of fat in the way, it'll keep that from happening and keep things a little bit more supple for a little longer. How are you guys' demos?
Good. Are we
Good?
Good to go?
You want to talk about what we're doing?
Yeah, let's do it.
I think we're good to go. And I believe after demo, if anyone wants to come up and eat, or we've got vegetables and beef.
Sweet.
Did you bring a plate?
What's that?
Bring your own plate.
Bring your own plate.
You know, for the organizers of Chef's Roll, they came out to our conference called Roots at the Chef's Garden last year. And leading up to this, I swear I thought this was one big fire festival thing.
I successfully did not make a fire festival reference. I deserve applause for that.
Yeah, you know, really happy to be here. I'm glad you guys were able to pull this off. Good job.
Yeah, thank you guys. So again, butter poaching vegetables is not just a thing that sounds nice on a menu. You're actually changing the texture of if you had poached this in something leaner. And I mean, this is has anybody here been to the Chef's Garden? Everything there tastes more than it does elsewhere. Like, truly, if you have a cucumber there, it tastes like every time you'd eaten a cucumber before, it came with like earmuffs. It was like, I don't want to blow your mind. And these guys like fully took the restrictor plate off. And this is, I don't know, food and the way we cook has changed a lot over the past like couple decades. I think one of the things that has stayed and will kind of always stay is chefs are constantly trying to figure out ways to just fold a flavor in on itself over and over and over again to make something that tastes as much like that thing as possible. And that was what I thought was really cool about this technique, right? Is you're poaching this ingredient, this vegetable, in liquid that will then adorn the vegetable itself. And it's so rarely done with vegetables. You do it all the time with meat.
Right.
You'll make, quintuple chicken stock as the base for your chicken gloss, but nobody does that with potatoes or with, turnips or rutabagas.
Right.
And it's crazy. And being able to capture both sides, the aroma and the taste side.
Sure.
Yeah.
Where's our bowls? You know what I thought was so good we could bridge this? Is Barbara Lynch here?
There you go.
Is she around? I don't see her. Barbara Lynch is, I think, made famous what she called butter soup, which was essentially a broth of butter that was poured over a lobster dish in her restaurant in Boston. So we're going to play with that here a little bit too. We'll just pour it over the vegetables. I heard she was here. This is for her.
Another thing specifically about butter poaching stuff, everybody here is probably familiar with the French Laundry butter poached lobster, butter poached oysters. It was clearly a thing. That is not just decadent. There's actually physics there. So when you talk about how heat is transmitted through liquids, heat travels a lot more rapidly through water than it does through fat. When you're frying something, it cooks really quickly because you're able to crank fats up to crazy high temperatures. But at the same temperature, at like 170 Fahrenheit, if you're poaching something in something water-based and poaching something in something fat-based, there's going to be sort of a slow trickle of heat from the butter into the product versus the like open fire hose from the water into the product. So if you have something like lobster and you're at a place like the French Laundry and the idea is, how do we possibly make this that much more delicate and gentle and elegant and refined? Even if you're doing this in an immersion circulator and you're doing it precision temperature, if you've dialed in that temperature perfectly, it's still going to be like a mad rush of heat coming into the product if you're using water. Poaching it in butter is a way to like regulate that flow of heat and make things go a little bit slower. And David, what do you got going on?
All right, so the Vitamix, what I've got going is a little bit of clarified butter and some miso. I'm going to add a little bit of glycerin and soy lecithin to it. Turn it into more of a solid foam. Mm-hmm. Put it in the ISI, charge it, and we end up with basically this.
All right. Foam is sauce thickened with bubbles. This is a sauce thickened with bubbles and also with carbs from the starch in the miso, with proteins from the protein in the miso and the protein in the butter, and with fat in the form of the lecithin. Correct. There's a little bit of water in here from the glycerin, And again, it's all the same stuff, just brought together in different ways.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So we're going to do that with a little bit of A5 Wagyu that's going to go on it. I took the butter solids, which we have here, and add a little bit of milk powder to it.
Which is just butter solids.
Which is just butter solids. Just
more butter solids.
More butter solids, just overloading it.
Yeah.
Get it browned, and then basically turn it into those.
How did you do that, Chef?
Just literally brown it and get the water off.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So it's just like dried butter shake.
It's like dried butter.
Dried butter graham cracker crumble.
It's it. It's crack. It's butter crack. So take a little bit of that, add a little more butter powder to it, and some togarashi.
Oh, that's cool.
Yep. And so now we got hot butter crack that we're going to put on the beef, along with a little bit of micro wasabi. And then to top it off, remember that jasmine butter I made?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was just like brewing jasmine tea into butter?
Yeah, I brew the tea in the butter, and you end up with something like that. Add a little bit of matcha to it. And so now, same butter, 3 different ways, 3 different textures, different aromas, different flavors that are going to come out as you enjoy it. A lot of fun.
How did you make this butter fat into powder?
Powder? Magic? No. Tapioca maltodextrin.
Who in here has done that? Put maltodextrin onto fat and it magically turns into a powder? You now have the tools to explain how that works. So you've got fat. How do you turn it into a powder? What is maltodextrin of the fundamental ingredients? It's a carb, right? It's a form of carb. Maltodextrin has the ability to just cling to fat, so that rather than all those little fat droplets being able to slide and flow around, they now each have a buddy of maltodextrin that anchors them and keeps them from sliding around, so they kind of tumble around and they become a powder. And did you say there was, so that was the clarified butter solids and butter fat in the matcha?
Correct.
One of my main issues with a lot of like spice blends, because you can make anything into a powder, is I'm sure you guys have all had that experience. We have something that's like covered in a spice that just really tastes like raw, like moldy cumin and cayenne. You know what the experience I'm talking about, where it's like it just feels very dry and it feels like you're not able to get the full impression of the spices? Again, one of the things that we really rely on to move aromas around in your mouth is fat. And if you've got fat embedded in like a togarashi blend, it's not going to come off just feeling like dry spices. It's going to feel like they bloom in your mouth because they're like all riding in this fat limousine around all the nooks and crannies in your mouth and floating up into your nose. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
How are we doing?
We're good. You tell me. It's 10:22.
All right. We've got a couple minutes for some more questions, and then I want you guys to get a chance to taste some stuff. Yes. Are there any food equations or like food things that happen and we have no scientific rhyme or reason for it? No. Well, I'll say this. There's stuff that we can't do, but this has been a game that like my partners and I have been playing for like 4 years now. Is there anything that you can talk about in food that can't be explained by this stuff? Not really. One thing, and that's not to say that you can do anything, but one of the things that's really cool about looking at food this way and breaking things down into building blocks is you can know what's possible and when you're just like trying to chase a ghost. I run a company, we do like consulting for retail brands of how to make stuff on a shelf taste good and kill you slower than it used to. We can do a lot of things. We will not make a shelf-stable green drink. There's no such thing, or we won't try. The color of green from chlorophyll in plants has a maximum like shelf life of a couple days. If there's anybody out there who has figured out how to make like sorrel puree green for more than a week, slide into my DMs, we'll make $1 billion together. There's just no way. And that's just based on this fundamental principle of there's a magnesium, there's a mineral that makes chlorophyll green. If it's anywhere near water, it's going to dissolve in the water and leave behind this like brown pigment. So yeah, like in theory, this will help us explain everything in food, but it doesn't necessarily help us solve the unsolvable, which is helpful because there's a ton of stuff that we can do without trying to chase these impossible tasks. Yeah. Sodium bisulfite? It will help for a little bit. That's like deep chemistry. It'll help. It'll maybe take something that has a week to like 10 days. But then if you're trying to get beyond that, it's really difficult. That's a good question, though. Yes? Yeah. That's a great question. People who avoid gluten but have no problems with sourdough versus like more highly processed bread. First of all, that's a nutrition question. I wake up every day and I look in the mirror and I say, it's super cool not to be a nutritionist. Because that is a very, very hard profession. It's taking all of this and trying to make conclusions about how all of this is going to go through your body versus the body of like a 79-year-old Turkish woman who smokes. Like, that's really, really hard to make those conclusions, putting different foods through such different machines. So the gluten question specifically, if you're able to eat gluten in any form, you're not celiac. So it's not actually an allergy. That doesn't mean that there may not be other things going on. The going theory is that in sourdough, stuff is broken down more. Remember those enzymes? Sourdough, stuff's being chopped up. There are actually there's beer out there that's not gluten-free, but it's called gluten removed, where they add an enzyme that chops up all of those proteins into individual amino acids. And food allergies are based on 3 amino acids or more. So amino acids are another like alphabet that make these proteins. Your body will recognize individual proteins and say, allergy, whether it's shellfish or gluten or whatever.
And we actually have that beer coming tomorrow, Duckfoot. They put that enzyme in, can't even taste the difference.
Heck yeah. I did not know that.
It's the company.
So basically, if you had a sourdough bread where it was so fermented that you broke the protein down into individual amino acids, nobody would have an allergy to it. It would also not rise because you would have completely removed the gluten from it. You might as well just make a gluten-free bread. But yeah, that's the thing is if you have something that is so broken down that it's just like glutamate and all those different amino acids, you can't have an allergy to it. It's like the FCC trying to ban the use of the letter F. Right? Like F can be used to make words that are problematic, but F as a letter, nobody's going to be allergic to. It's sort of like that. Yeah. I know that like gluten intolerance is sort of a hot button issue and people are like, it's all made up. My thought is, yeah, like a tiny fraction of the people who avoid gluten are actually allergic to it. But with everything that's going on in 2019, if you think that avoiding gluten makes you feel this much better, who am I to say don't do it?
Yeah, you're in San Diego now, man. You gotta.
That's all I'm saying.
Those helicopter.
Other questions? Yes. Yes. Aquafaba. Has everybody heard this term? Aquafaba is the juice left over from cooking legumes. Jamie just demoed basically rutafaba, aqua ruta. All it is just starch and protein that has leached out of legumes as it's cooking that, surprise, is good at thickening shit. Aquafaba, like the juice left over from chickpeas, there's a company called Sir Kensington's that made a vegan mayonnaise that's thickened with like chickpea juice, which is cool, but honestly, that should not be news. Right? Any source of dissolved proteins and carbs is going to be able to thicken things and make foams and stabilize all this stuff. It's what we do every day in the kitchen. So that's what Aquafaba is. It's a super cool sort of tool because it's a nicely curated combo of proteins and carbs that help us do a lot of things that eggs do. But it's not necessarily special in being able to do that. Again, it got great PR boost from Tumblr. So yeah, great question. 2 more questions. Come on, there's got to be. Yeah, back. MSG, what's the deal? What? Somebody amplify that. What's the like about it? Oh, I like MSG because it's savory, and because it's in every molecule of every living thing on planet Earth, and because human mother's milk has 10 times the natural MSG of cow's milk, and
So-
it's unavoidable.
It's tasty.
So enjoy your tomatoes alongside your little tablet of MSG because they're the same thing. I like it because it's savory, and it's one of the fundamental tastes, and we would literally all die and our brains would shut down without it. So there's a lot of what? There's a lot of hate for it. Most of it is based on surprise racism in the American food culture back in the 50s and 60s. We can dig into that later. Not eating MSG is racist, is basically what I'm saying. Yes. Yeah. MSG is basically just, see this protein, this like sort of chain of little tiny little balls? MSG is one of, or glutamic acid, is one of the amino acids that make up proteins. So there is glutamate in proteins that are making my fingers move right now. There is also free glutamate where it's been lopped off of one of those proteins. That, when there is salt present, tastes like umami. That's all it is. So not only do tomatoes and oysters and whatever that we've been told have a lot of natural MSG have it, but anything that has been long fermented, so your long fermented sourdough, gluten removed beer, like all of this stuff where proteins are being chopped up, there's probably going to be some glutamic acid. If there's sodium, i.e. salt, anywhere in your food, monosodium glutamate, bring them together, MSG. Great question, yeah. Preservation. Yeah, most valuable ideas for food preservation that might help food waste. Personally, I think every piece of vegetable trim in America should be salted with 2% salt and allowed to lacto-ferment. There's a company in the Bay Area in Berkeley. It's called The Cultured Pickle. It's a husband and wife team, Kevin and Alex, who I think are the best picklers on planet Earth. They specialize in a lot of like really esoteric, old school Japanese styles of fermentation. They do stuff that has roots in old world Europe. It's amazing, and honestly, just allowing lactic acid bacteria to make stuff sour and delicious, I think we should all have like a gazillion different types of waste stream pickles. Do you guys have favorite preservation?
Salt, I think, is king when it comes to preservation. For us, we have a great root cellar and work with the seasons as if it was an old farmhouse or something. But salt is the future for all of those vegetable crops. Even like juice pulp that comes out of the juicer, all of that gets lacto-fermented.
You like lacto-fermented it and then just kind of aged?
Yeah.
That's another thing is if you have that stuff and you age it, these guys at Cultured Pickle that I was talking about, every summer they take what they call June garlic, which is like young garlic in the Bay Area, and they bury it in miso. And then that miso is going to continue, still continue to have enzymes, it's going to continue to digest itself. After they pull the garlic out and after it's done pickling in miso, they leave that miso in a back corner of their walk-in from anywhere from 1 to 10 years. And it basically turns into like balsamic miso, where it just gets darker and caramellier and just keeps going. And that's one of the really fun things about preservation is, at least in the United States, we like pickle something, put it on the menu, and then it's done. But if you have a lot of something great and you're preserving it and you're reining things in so that it at least becomes safe, hanging on to it and forgetting about it for like 6 months to 10 years, it's how you get Noma. Like, for real, like so much of the like eye-popping restaurants of right now are people who are just letting the sands of time and that slow like vibration of, imagine library books turning into barbecue, imagine if that was a rutabaga. That's a huge thing. What about preservation, things you like to do?
Well, on the other end of the spectrum, we use a lot of freeze dryers.
Oh, yeah.
So we love freeze dried. Yeah.
One more thing? What's that? Samples are ready. Cool. Jamie, to your burying stuff, covering stuff in salt, making everything into a caper. Again, you have a dinner coming up that's like 100 courses for 100 people.
That's correct.
Let's say you put a clarified butter course on that menu, or a course that required clarified butter. If you ended up with like 4 pounds of butter solids, you could salt that and use that as your curing vessel for, you know, turning a Hubbard squash into a prosciutto, and just rubbing it and curing it and allowing it to happen. And it would be so meaty and buttery and gamey and lovely. And
We need to try that.
Get into that black coffee you were talking about a little bit.
black coffee?
With butter solids instead of coffee.
Oh yeah. So if you really took butter solids as far as they could possibly go towards just being beyond brown butter, I have a feeling if you did it well, you could kind of roast it like coffee and brew coffee from it. And I think that would make the coolest pre-dessert in some really overthought restaurant. I've been wanting to try that, and I think we should try it. Because honestly, that's all coffee is. A bunch of proteins and sugars browning. Why can't we do that with any other source of proteins and sugars? So we have samples.
We do.
Are they going to be, I'm assuming they're going to be passed out? Yeah, passed out? Okay, so that's going to start coming. Thanks to Butter of Europe for supplying us with delicious things.
Yes.
You good with that?
Honestly, we use butter every day. Hopefully now you're gonna start looking at butter and see all kinds of things moving beneath the surface, because now you have X-ray vision. We'll be up here if you guys have questions or want to come taste things. Otherwise, I think food's gonna start making its rounds.
Okay.
Cool.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Nice work. Beautiful.
Cool.
Good job.